I stood in my kitchen that Sunday morning, holding my phone with trembling hands, staring at text messages that would destroy everything I thought I knew about my marriage. My coffee had gone cold 20 minutes ago, but I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The woman I'd loved for 15 years had just vanished, replaced by a stranger whose words on that screen felt like poison seeping into my soul. But before I tell you what I found that morning and what I did about it, please hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Stories like this one need to be shared, and your support helps me bring you more truth from the shadows of everyday life. Now let me take you back to where it all began. My name is David, and I've been a pastor at Covenant Community Church for 12 years. It's a modest congregation in suburban Ohio, about 200 faithful souls who trust me to guide them through life's storms. My wife, Sarah, well, Sarah was everything a pastor's wife should be: beautiful, articulate, devoted. She ran the women's ministry, organized charity drives, and had built quite the following with her blog, Sacred Homemaking, 50,000 followers, hanging on her every word about Christian marriage, family values, and living a godly life. The irony wasn't lost on me even then. You see, Sarah had this gift. She could make anyone feel like they were the most important person in the room. When she smiled at you during service, when she touched your arm during prayer, when she listened to your problems with those soft brown eyes, you felt chosen, special. I thought I was lucky to be her husband. I thought I was the one she'd chosen above all others. I was wrong. It started with little things. Sarah staying up late, typing furiously on her laptop. "Just working on the blog, honey," she'd say, closing it quickly when I walked by. Her phone buzzing constantly, notifications from her ministry work that seemed to require immediate attention even during our family dinners with our two kids, Emma and Joshua. "You know how passionate I am about helping other women," she'd explain, eyes already back on the screen. "Mrs. Henderson is going through a difficult time with her marriage." The perfect pastor's wife response. How could I argue with ministry? Then came the late-night counseling sessions at the church, the weekend retreats she organized that I couldn't attend because someone needed to watch the kids. The new clothes, the subtle changes in her perfume, the way she'd step outside to take certain calls. "It's just women's ministry stuff, David. You wouldn't understand." And you know what? I didn't push, because I trusted her. Because challenging your wife's ministry work feels like challenging God himself when you're a pastor. Because sometimes it's easier to ignore the growing pit in your stomach than to face what it might mean. 3 months ago, everything changed when 22-year-old Tyler Morrison joined our congregation. Fresh out of college, handsome in that clean-cut, all-American way that makes mothers nudge their daughters during service. He was eager, enthusiastic about faith, and volunteered for everything. Sarah took him under her wing immediately. "He's going through a spiritual awakening," she told me over dinner one night. "His family wasn't religious, so he needs guidance understanding Christian community." I've been mentoring him. Mentoring, that's what she called it. Tyler started showing up everywhere, helping with the youth group, joining our small group Bible study, volunteering for Sarah's charity events, always hovering near her, always ready with a helpful hand or an admiring smile. The way he looked at her, it should have been my first warning. But pastors are supposed to see the best in people, right? We're supposed to believe in redemption, in the power of faith to transform lives. When I noticed Tyler's obvious crush on my wife, I told myself it was harmless. A young man confused about appropriate boundaries, projecting his search for spiritual guidance onto an attractive mentor figure. I was so naive. The signs became impossible to ignore 6 weeks ago. Sarah's blog posts grew more frequent, more intimate. She wrote about the passion that Christ calls us to in all aspects of life, and the fire that burns within us when we truly submit to God's will. Her comment sections exploded with admiration, particularly from young men asking for private spiritual guidance. "You have such a gift for reaching people," I told her one evening, reading over her shoulder. "Some of these comments are quite intense. The Lord works through all of us in different ways," she replied, but she closed the laptop again. Always closing the laptop. That night, she left her phone charging in the kitchen while she showered. It buzzed and buzzed and buzzed. I shouldn't have looked. A pastor should trust his wife. A Christian man should respect privacy. But the buzzing wouldn't stop, and something deep in my chest was screaming that I needed to see. The messages were from Tyler. Can't stop thinking about this afternoon. Your husband doesn't deserve you. When can we be alone again? My hands shook as I scrolled up. Days of messages, weeks, planning meetings, sharing secrets. And then, the photos. The kind of photos a married woman doesn't send to her spiritual mentee. I set the phone down and walked to our bedroom. Sarah was still in the shower, humming a hymn, How Great Thou Art, while washing off whatever she'd done that afternoon with a boy young enough to be her son. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening to her peaceful breathing beside me. My wife, my partner in ministry, the woman who counseled other women about faithfulness and godly marriage. The woman who'd stood beside me for 12 years of sermons about trust, commitment, and the sanctity of marriage vows. The woman who was living a lie. But I didn't confront her. Not yet, because I needed to understand the scope of this betrayal. I needed to know if this was a momentary weakness or something deeper, something more calculating, something that would change everything I thought I knew about the woman I'd married. So I started paying attention, really paying attention. Sarah's blog posts took on new meaning when I read them with open eyes. Her passionate writings about surrendering to temptation and finding God in unexpected places weren't spiritual metaphors. They were confessions hidden in plain sight. She was writing about her affair while thousands of Christian women praised her wisdom. The comments section became a different kind of hell when I recognized the pattern. Tyler wasn't just commenting as TM22. He was one of dozens of young men drawn to her online persona. Men asking for private counseling. Men praising her beauty alongside her spiritual insights. Men whose comments she responded to with flirtatious spiritual guidance. The Lord calls us to be vessels of His love, she'd written in response to one particularly forward comment. Sometimes that love flows in ways we don't expect. How many others were there? How long had this been going on? The worst part wasn't the betrayal itself. It was watching her perform the role of devoted wife and spiritual leader while planning her next rendezvous with Tyler. She'd kiss me goodbye in the morning, post an Instagram story about blessed to serve alongside my godly husband, and then meet Tyler at the motel on Highway 32 for what she told me were women's ministry planning sessions. 3 weeks ago, I hired a private investigator. I know it feels wrong, invasive, unchristian, but I needed evidence. Not for confrontation, but for understanding. I needed to know if I was losing my mind or if the woman I'd built my life around was systematically destroying everything we'd built together. The photos came back last Tuesday. Sarah and Tyler at the Comfort Inn, Sarah and Tyler at Riverside Park, Sarah and Tyler at his apartment while I was at the church office preparing sermons about forgiveness and trust. But the worst photo was from 2 days ago. Sarah and Tyler at the little cafe downtown where she and I had our first date 16 years ago. They were holding hands across the same table where I'd nervously asked her to be my girlfriend. She was wearing the necklace I'd given her for our 10th anniversary, a cross with our initials engraved on the back. That's when I knew this wasn't just about sex. This wasn't just a middle-aged woman having a crisis. This was calculated, deliberate. She was rewriting our history, creating new memories in the same places where we'd built our love. And through it all, she kept writing her blog, kept posting about authentic Christian marriage and the importance of trust between spouses, kept collecting praise from women who saw her as their spiritual guide while she was systematically betraying everything she claimed to represent. Yesterday morning, I made a decision. I was going to tell our congregation the truth. Not out of revenge, though God knows the anger was eating me alive. Not out of hurt, though the pain felt like it was killing me from the inside. But because 200 people trusted us to lead them spiritually. Because Sarah's blog was influencing thousands of women to model their marriages after ours. Because the lie was bigger than just our marriage. The lie was poison in the body of Christ itself. I spent yesterday afternoon preparing what I would say. How do you tell your congregation that their spiritual leader's wife is everything she's preached against? How do you maintain your role as pastor while admitting your personal life is a sham? So then I remembered something. The text messages Tyler had sent that morning, I first discovered their affair. I'd taken photos of Sarah's phone screen, evidence I'd kept but never planned to use. Until now. This morning I arrived at church early. I changed the sermon I'd planned to preach a message about forgiveness from Ephesians. Instead, I prepared something different, something that would reveal the truth while still ministering to my congregation. And I titled it, The Pharisees Among Us, When Leaders Live in Darkness. Sarah arrived at her usual time, radiant in her Sunday best. She kissed my cheek in front of the congregation, whispered, "I love you," loud enough for the front row to hear, and took her seat in the front pew where she always sat, the picture of the devoted pastor's wife. Tyler slipped in during the opening hymn, taking his usual seat 3 rows behind Sarah. They didn't acknowledge each other, but I caught the brief eye contact, the small smile Sarah gave him when she thought no one was looking. The performance was flawless. It had probably been flawless for months. "Good morning, beloved congregation," I began, standing behind the pulpit, where I'd preached hundreds of sermons about truth, faithfulness, and walking in the light. Today I want to talk to you about deception, about the wolves that sometimes hide among the sheep, about the danger of leaders who say one thing and do another. Sarah smiled at me from the front row, nodding encouragingly like she always did during my sermons. She had no idea what was coming. Turn with me to Matthew chapter 23, where Jesus speaks to the Pharisees. "Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You are like whitewashed tombs which look beautiful on the outside, but on the inside are full of the bones of the dead and everything unclean." A few people murmured, "Amen." Sarah's smile never wavered. "Now, I want to read you something," I continued, pulling out my phone. "These are words written by someone in our community, someone who teaches others about moral living and Christian values, someone many of you look up to as an example of godly womanhood." I started reading from Sarah's blog, but not the sanitized spiritual post she published. I read from her private messages to Tyler, messages I documented, messages that revealed her true thoughts about our marriage, about our congregation, about the people who trusted her. "David is so naive," I read aloud. "He believes everything I tell him about ministry work. The man preaches about wisdom, but can't see what's right in front of him." The congregation shifted uncomfortably. Sarah's face went white. "These church people are so judgmental. They worship the idea of perfection, but have no idea what real passion looks like. They follow my blog because they want to believe in some fantasy of Christian marriage, but they wouldn't last a day in my shoes." Sarah stood up abruptly, but I continued reading. "Meet me at the usual place tonight. I can't stand another evening pretending to be the perfect pastor's wife. At least with you, I can be myself." The sanctuary was dead silent now. Tyler had gone pale as a sheet. Sarah was backing toward the exit, but I wasn't finished. "I'm thinking about leaving David after the kids graduate. I've been building my platform long enough. The blog is profitable now, and I don't need his credibility anymore. I just need to be careful about timing. Pastors' wives who abandon their families don't usually keep their followings." And then I read the worst one. The message that had made me realize this wasn't just betrayal, it was strategic destruction. The funny thing is, I think David might actually forgive me if I confessed. He's that pathetic. He believes so much in redemption and second chances that he'd probably convince himself it was his fault somehow. But I don't want forgiveness. I want freedom, and I want to take as much as I can with me when I go. Sarah was at the door now, her hand on the handle. The congregation was staring at her with a mixture of shock, disgust, and something that might have been pity. "Sarah," I called out, my voice carrying across the silent sanctuary, "would you like to add anything to today's sermon?" She turned back to face me, and for the first time in months I saw her without the mask, without the performance. Just the woman who had been systematically destroying our life together while building her platform on the lie of our marriage. "You had no right," she said, her voice shaking with rage, not shame. "Those were private conversations. Nothing is private when it's built on lies that hurt other people," I replied. "You've been counseling women about marriage while destroying ours. You've been teaching about integrity while living in deception. You've been profiting from a lie that affects everyone in this room. Tyler stood up suddenly. Pastor, I... Sit down, son, I said quietly. Your turn to speak will come later. Sarah looked around the sanctuary at faces she'd smiled at for 12 years. Faces of women who'd trusted her guidance. Faces of families who'd invited her into their most intimate struggles because they believed she understood godly marriage. None of you understand, she said, her voice rising. None of you understand what it's like to live in a fishbowl, to have every move scrutinized, every word analyzed, to be expected to be perfect when you're just human. Mrs. Henderson, whose marriage Sarah had supposedly been counseling, stood up from the back pew. So you decided to tear down everyone else's idea of marriage instead? You decided to make money off lies? I help people, Sarah shouted. My blog helped thousands of women. Your blog was a lie, I said simply. Every word of advice you gave about trust and faithfulness and commitment was a lie. You weren't helping them build stronger marriages. You were modeling exactly what destroys them. Sarah's composure finally cracked completely. You think you're so righteous, David? You think you're perfect? You ignored me for years. You chose this church over your family every single time. You made me into an accessory for your ministry instead of treating me like a wife. The congregation was watching our marriage dissolve in real time, watching 15 years of apparent love and partnership reveal itself as something much more complex and broken. And you know what? She wasn't entirely wrong. You're right, I said, and the admission seemed to surprise everyone, including Sarah. I failed you as a husband. I chose my role as pastor over my role as your partner more times than I can count. I took you for granted. I assumed your support without nurturing our relationship. The sanctuary was so quiet you could hear the old building settling. But that doesn't excuse what you chose to do about it, I continued. You had options: marriage counseling, honest conversation, even divorce if that's what you needed. What you chose instead was to live a lie while profiting from other people's trust. You chose to seduce a young man barely out of college. You chose to build a platform on the foundation of our marriage while planning to destroy it. Sarah was crying now, but they were angry tears. I gave you everything. I supported your dreams, your calling, your precious church. And what did I get? A husband who saw me as a role to play instead of a person to love. Then why didn't you leave? The question came from Emma, our 17-year-old daughter, who had been sitting in stunned silence in the youth section. If Dad was so terrible, why didn't you just leave instead of this? Sarah turned to look at our daughter, our beautiful, trusting daughter, who had admired her mother's strength and faith, who had planned to major in Christian counseling because she wanted to help families the way she thought her mother did. Because leaving would have cost me everything, Sarah whispered, and in that moment, I think she finally told the complete truth. The blog, the platform, the respect. Nobody follows divorced pastors' wives. I built something real, something valuable, and I wasn't going to give it up because your father couldn't see past his own needs. Our son Joshua, 15 and still trying to process what he'd heard, stood up from beside his sister. So you were going to take it all anyway, after using Dad to build it? Sarah looked at our children, the kids who had believed in her integrity, who had defended her online when critics questioned her authenticity, who had been proud of their mother's influence in Christian circles. I was going to take what I earned, she said defiantly. That's when I realized something that maybe should have occurred to me earlier. This wasn't just about an affair. This wasn't even just about a failing marriage. This was about a woman who had systematically used her role as a pastor's wife to build personal influence and financial independence, while planning to abandon the people who made it possible. The blog wasn't her ministry. It was her escape plan. How long? I asked quietly. How long have you been planning this? She looked at me for a long moment, and I saw the woman I'd fallen in love with 16 years ago. The woman who had stood beside me when I felt called to ministry. The woman who had supported my dreams, even when they meant financial sacrifice and constant scrutiny. But I also saw the woman who had spent the last 3 years systematically planning to leave that life behind while profiting from the pretense that she was committed to it. Since Emma started high school, she admitted, I realized I had maybe 5 years before both kids were gone, and you wouldn't need the perfect pastor's wife anymore. I needed to build something that was mine, something you couldn't take away from me if you decided to discard me for a younger woman who could play the role better. The confession hit me like a physical blow. She hadn't been planning to leave me. She'd been planning to leave me first. I started, but she cut me off. Don't. Don't pretend you haven't noticed how the congregation looks at other pastors' wives. Younger ones, prettier ones. Don't pretend you haven't seen how quickly churches replace pastors who can't maintain the image. She was right about that too. I had seen it happen. Churches that forced out pastors whose wives couldn't fulfill the unspoken expectations. Congregations that lost respect for leaders whose personal lives became complicated or messy. But I had never planned to replace her. The thought had never occurred to me, even during our worst times. So Tyler was what? I asked. Practice for the new life you were building? Sarah glanced back at Tyler, who was still sitting frozen in his pew, probably wishing he'd never set foot in our church. Tyler was a reminder that I could still be wanted for myself, not for what I could do for someone else's ministry, not for how I could make someone else look good, just for me. The sadness in her voice was real. The pain was real. The years of feeling invisible in her own marriage were real. But so was the betrayal. So was the lie. So was the systematic deception of people who had trusted her with their most vulnerable moments. Mrs. Sarah? The voice came from the back of the sanctuary. Mrs. Chen, whose marriage had been saved, she'd told us, by following Sarah's blog advice about perseverance and trust. I shared your post with my daughter when she was having problems with her husband. I told her you were proof that Christian marriage could be beautiful. What do I tell her now? Sarah turned to face the congregation she'd served for 12 years. The people whose money had supported our family. The people who had celebrated our anniversaries and praised our partnership as an example of godly marriage. I don't know, she whispered. And in that moment, I think she finally understood the full scope of what she'd done. It wasn't just our marriage she destroyed. It wasn't just our family she damaged. It was the faith of every person who had believed in the authenticity of what we'd presented to the world. Tyler finally spoke up. Pastor, I know this doesn't help, but I never wanted it to happen like this. She told me you two were separated, that you were staying together for appearances until the kids graduated. Another lie, another manipulation. Sarah had used Tyler's inexperience and genuine feelings to create a situation that served her purposes while protecting her reputation. Tyler, I said, and my voice was surprisingly gentle. You're young. You made mistakes, but you're not the one who betrayed a marriage or built a career on deception. You're going to be okay. Sarah was still standing by the door, and I could see her calculating, wondering if she could salvage anything from this disaster, wondering if she could spin this into another platform, the repentant pastor's wife, the woman who found redemption after failure. I knew her well enough to recognize the wheels turning. Sarah, I said, it's over. The blog, the platform, the performance, it's all over. She nodded slowly. I know. What happens now? Emma asked, her voice small and scared. I looked at my children, our children who would have to navigate the aftermath of this public destruction of everything they'd believed about their family. Now we deal with the truth, I said. Now we figure out how to move forward without lies. Sarah opened the door to leave, then paused. David, for what it's worth, I did love you once, before I started hating what our life had become. I know, I said. I loved you too, all of you, even the parts you thought I couldn't see. She left then, and Tyler followed her out after a moment of hesitation. The congregation sat in stunned silence, processing what they'd witnessed. Mrs. Henderson was the first to speak. Pastor, what do we do now? I looked out at the faces of people who had trusted me to lead them spiritually, who had just watched their pastor's marriage explode in the most public way possible. Now we learn something about forgiveness that we've never had to learn before, I said. We learn what it means to forgive without excusing, to acknowledge hurt without becoming bitter, to rebuild trust after it's been shattered. I paused, thinking about my own next steps. And we learn what it means to lead from a place of brokenness instead of pretending we have all the answers. 3 months later, Sarah and I are divorced. She tried to maintain her blog, but the backlash was swift and brutal. Her follower count dropped from 50,000 to fewer than 3,000 in 2 weeks. The speaking engagements dried up. The book deal she'd been negotiating disappeared. She's working at a real estate office now, trying to rebuild a life that's actually hers instead of one built on the foundation of someone else's calling. Tyler transferred to a college in another state. We've had one conversation since everything happened, and he seems to be doing well. The church. Well, the church is healing, slowly. Some families left; they couldn't handle the messiness of imperfect leadership, but many stayed. They said they'd rather have a pastor who was honest about his failures than one who pretended to be perfect. I still preach every Sunday, but my sermons are different now, more honest, less about having all the answers and more about walking through questions together. People seem to connect with them in a way they never did with my old polished messages. Emma is starting college next fall, majoring in social work instead of Christian counseling. She says she wants to help people without the pressure of representing God's will. Joshua is doing okay. Teenage resilience is remarkable. He's angry at his mother, but he's processing it in therapy. As for me, I'm learning what it means to be human in public, to be a leader who admits he doesn't have it all figured out, to be a man who failed at marriage but is still worthy of love and respect. The irony is that I'm a better pastor now than I ever was when my marriage looked perfect from the outside. Brokenness, it turns out, is excellent preparation for ministering to broken people. Sarah was right about one thing: we were living in a fishbowl and the pressure was enormous. But where she chose deception, I'm choosing transparency. Where she chose self-preservation, I'm choosing vulnerability. It's scarier this way, but it's real. And after years of living a lie, real feels like a gift. So there you have it. The day I destroyed my marriage in public to save my integrity. The day I chose truth over reputation and discovered that sometimes the cost of honesty is worth paying. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever had to choose between protecting someone you love and protecting people they were hurting? Have you ever discovered that the person you thought you knew was living a completely different life? And if this story resonated with you, please subscribe to the channel and share it with someone who might need to hear it. Sometimes we all need reminding that the truth, however painful, is better than the most beautiful lie. Thanks for listening. I'll see you in the next one.